All right, girls and boys, let us talk today about exploitation. All right. First, we'll talk about exploitation as it is understood in Vrousalis' Exploitation, a Primer, and then we'll talk about Philip K. Dick's short story Captive Market and how those two pieces complement or shed light on one another. Okay, so Vrousalis first. Okay, so Vrousalis says, is sort of in terms of sort of setting up the conversation, Vrousalis says, he's trying to think of exploitation as a kind of dysfunction, a kind of way things can go wrong in positive sum interactions. Okay, so there are negative sum interactions where two people come together and the sort of total value that they leave with is less than what they started with. So, you might think of a fist fight as a negative sum interaction. People leave with more unhappiness. They leave with less value than what they came to it with. You could have a zero sum interaction. So, maybe two people are playing dice and, whatever one person wins, the other person loses or something like that. But you could have a positive sum interaction where two people come together and they create more value than they came together with. So, our business relationships are examples of things like this. So, people getting together to form businesses to provide useful goods and services that we couldn't provide on our own. Friendships and romantic relationships might count as examples of positive sum interactions. Okay, and you might think, well, okay, positive sum interaction. That just sounds like good. Those are just like good across the board. If two people come together and they create more value than they had at the outset, well, then isn't that just like groovy? What sorts of problems might we have with those? And Vrousalis' piece is sort of devoted to understanding what these problems might be. He sort of says, well, there's this sort of schematic definition of exploitation, where he says somebody exploits somebody else if they benefit from a social relationship with them by taking advantage of them. But that's sort of schematic, that's like incomplete, that's like a blueprint for a definition and not the definition itself, because the big question is, well, what does taking advantage mean? Okay, and the way that Vrousalis sets up the discussion, he's trying to define exploitation. He's trying to come up with a more precise concept by defining exploitation, a more precise or explicit concept. And so he evaluates various proposed definitions in terms of whether all of the kind of most uncontroversial examples of exploitation fit the definition, or whether the definition sort of does what he wants a definition of exploitation to do, which is to, carve out a specific, real kind of dysfunction that we see in positive sum interactions. Okay. I think it might be more helpful, while I think this sort of definition project can be interesting and fruitful and, intellectually stimulating, it might be more helpful for our purposes to think of the discussion in terms of sort of listing possible harms that can come with exploitation, and maybe thinking about the conditions under which these harms aren't so bad, or possible wrongs that can be committed, possible sort of moral hazards, moral problems that you might encounter in positive sum interactions. So he runs through a number of these harms, or a number of these possible wrongs. So he says, well, maybe you could hurt somebody in the course of exploiting them. So, although this is going to be a little tricky, because typically in positive sum interactions, people will benefit from the interaction somehow or other. So the idea of hurting that's involved is not necessarily super clear. Maybe it has something to do with treating the person sort of merely as a means, sort of using somebody without their consent, coercing them or forcing them to do something. Okay, maybe it has something to do with sort of picking on people when they're especially vulnerable. Although he argues that, well, that's often bad, but not always bad. Ultimately, his preferred theory of exploitation is the domination theory. So he thinks what's really wrong with exploitation in every case is that one party benefits from another by dominating them. Where he doesn't define domination here, but I think we can think of domination as any relationship where there's some power imbalance between two people or two parties, and the power imbalance is fixed. It's very resistant to change, and the people are trapped in that relationship. So as long as you're going to stay in that relationship, there's this power imbalance. Okay, so ultimately, Vrousalis thinks the domination theory of exploitation is the right one. Okay. So he gives a number of sort of examples of exploitation. Some of them are sort of abstract sketches of examples, and some of them are sort of thinly described in the way that philosophers sort of thought experiments, their sort of made up examples can be. So, for example, he refers time and again to a pit case where somebody's stuck at the bottom of a pit. You fell down to the bottom of a well, and somebody comes along and offers you a rope ladder, but only in exchange for $1 million. Okay. We might think of other examples of exploitation. My own sort of personal favorite involves the minimum wage. So, of course, the minimum wage is controversial, but the whole point of having a minimum wage is that people are willing to work for less than the minimum wage. But, there's this thought that, like, well, even if you think you would benefit, and even if, in fact, you would benefit from less than minimum wage work, these benefits are so lopsided or so domineering or so exploitative of people's vulnerabilities, or one way or another, there's something wrong with them. They're somehow exploitative. That we've cooked up this law that says okay, no working for less than the minimum wage. Okay. Good. So we have a couple of examples sort of on the table: the Pitt case, and more controversially, the minimum wage case. But we get a much richer sort of and both sort of more bizarre and outlandish example, but in a way an example that sort of drives things home, as science fiction tends to do, at least good science fiction, in Philip K. Dick's story Captive Market. Okay, so in this story, Edna Berthelsen is, we find out, trading goods and services with these people from the future that she alone can visit through this kind of time warp. And they give her cash in exchange for the various products that they need. And she charges what they all recognize to be very high prices. But side note, this is one of Vrousalis' theories of exploitation, that exploitation is charging people unfair prices for goods or their labor or whatever. She charges these unfair prices, but in some sense, the prices don't mean anything to the people from the future, because they live in this sort of post-apocalyptic sort of hellscape where there are no stores anymore, so they have no use for their cash. So, to some extent, while they resent that Berthelsen is charging them very large quantities of cash for their in exchange for the goods that she's selling them, they don't really need the cash at all. They get nothing out of it. Okay. But then you find out at the end of the story, at least if I'm reading it correctly, that Berthelsen doesn't just have the unique ability to travel through this time warp, but she has the unique ability to sort of see various possible futures and to pick one as the future that actually comes to pass. And so she sees various possible futures where the people that she's been trading with sort of fly off to Venus and never to be seen again, or they fly up and then the plane just explodes, or their spaceship just explodes, and that's that. But instead, she finds the one possibility where they start to fly up to Venus, but their plane malfunctions and they crash back to Earth, where she can continue to trade with them. Okay. And you get this, and this is basically how the story ends. She does this, and the sense is that this they're stuck in this trade relationship indefinitely. Okay. One thing to ask is how do any of the particular sort of theories of exploitation that are discussed in Vrousalis apply especially well? Well, there's the concern about fair prices, that she's charging exorbitant prices for the goods that she's selling them. But that turns out to be kind of a red herring because because the cash means nothing to these people from the future. I think the vulnerability theory of exploitation applies pretty well here, right? That part of the harm here, part of the sense of the sliminess of Berthelsen's actions can be explained in terms of the fact that these people in the future are very vulnerable. They're sick, they're stuck, they have no other options. Okay. But I think also the domination theory perhaps applies especially well. The Dick story might be a sort of a good argument, or offer the basis of the beginning of a good argument for Vrousalis' view. What you find out at the end of the story, the real horror is that she's keeping them stuck in this trading relationship. And it's that if we understand dominating somebody as keeping them stuck in a relationship in which they're dependent or subservient to you, well, there you go. Okay. It's also worth asking, in this story, what makes it the case that exploitation happens here? So I think there are a bunch of, why does Berthelsen exploit these people rather than, not exploiting them, giving them the things they need or something like that without hurting them or treating them unfairly, something like that. Okay, I think one answer to this question is sort of a psychological answer. You find out Berthelsen is this sort of cold, calculating, profit-obsessed person, and it's cold, calculating, profit-obsessed people who are especially likely to become exploiters. Other explanations of what's going on here are more sort of structural or economic. Okay, maybe it's not that she's sort of innately cold or calculating or profit obsessed, but that by being a business owner, by being a capitalist, even on this very small scale of running a little country store, that sort of encourages this sort of ruthlessly profit-seeking behavior. I'll say I think that's an idea that's in the story, although I think we should a big red warning sign should go off at this point. You should say, wait a second, does every grandma who runs a country store, really act like this? Are they all ruthlessly profit obsessed? I think the answer is probably not. But maybe this is what happens sometimes, that sort of, it's, something about the business environment which brings out these exploitative tendencies in people. Okay. Partly it might be that that Berthelsen has a monopoly, that she has a monopoly. She's the only person who can sell goods to these people. Maybe partly it's also, and so you can think of all sorts of examples of economic exploitation where it's monopoly, or where there's only one seller in a market, or monopsony, where there's only one buyer in a market, where things are ripe for exploitation. So maybe you think of a company town where there's only one real employer and everybody works for that one company. Well, that company can kind of treat you however they want, right? Because they have a monopsony. They're the only people buying the labor around. You can't easily just sort of pick up and take your business elsewhere, take your labor elsewhere. Maybe you think of internet service providers in New York City, where in many apartment buildings, there's only one ISP which will service your apartment, and so they can, they have a monopoly in your building. They can charge you whatever they want. Okay, and so on. So maybe you think monopoly is what's involved here. Maybe part of what's going on here is that we're also dealing with not just vulnerability in general, but a specific type of vulnerability on the part of the people in the future, that they depend on Berthelsen for their lives, And so maybe when it's, this is also the case in the Pitt case that Vrousalis discusses. So maybe exploitation is especially likely to, happen in environments where there is at least that's part, I think, a suggestion of the story, at least in environments where the one person depends on some transaction with another person for their life or for some just extremely important good or service. So, um, uh, it's worth asking these sorts of why questions, not just for the purposes of understanding the story, although, it's nice to understand stories, but for asking, okay, well, where are the opportunities for exploitation in our own societies and in our own lives, in our financial transactions with other people, but also in our personal relationships, right? And, how could we work towards both personal lives and social structures or a type of society that makes exploitation uh, less likely or perhaps impossible in one or another of its various forms. Okay, I'll stop there.